Welcome to actually what is my first YouTube lecture of this year, 2018, but it's one of, quite a few that I've done over the last few years. But this one is going to be very specific on George Washington's administration for you APUSH students. I'm going to cover just really the key concepts and some of the examples that you would want to use, so you have some sort of a historical background to what is the key concept for this particular time period. So again, this is dealing with George Washington, who is a two-term president. He won the first two elections, basically we say unopposed, and both times his vice president was John Adams. So in starting then, we'll start here in key concept 3.2, Roman numeral 3, letter A, where it literally mentions Washington's name along there with John Adams. It says during their presidential administrations, it says political leaders created institutions and precedents that put the principles of the Constitution into practice. When Washington began his career as president, there was nothing he can turn to for guidance. He is the first. No matter what other history teacher might tell you out there, he is the first president. You can't count those guys during the Articles of Confederation because there's no executive branch under the Articles of Confederation. They were presidents of Congress, but not a president of the United States. Washington is setting precedent here. For everything he does, sets a precedent. He takes a blueprint for what they think the president should be, what government should be, and as I wrote here, he turns it into a working state. Now, yes, John Adams is the first vice president. Two other very important people we're going to be talking a lot about is Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury. And we'll get into a little bit specifically here with Hamilton and Jefferson in a moment. But one of the first things that Congress has got to do, they know what the first two branches of government are. Obviously, Article 1 creates Congress, the legislative branch, lawmakers. Article 2, your executive branch, your president. He will execute the law. But this Article 3, which is judiciary branch, there was a lot of going back and forth during the Constitutional Convention as to what they really wanted. Remember, southern states are always afraid that once you get a federal government that has too much power over the states, the fear becomes very evident that what if they start passing laws, they go against your state laws, specifically slavery. So there's a lot of arguing going on in the Constitutional Convention, and eventually they wind up just kind of leaving it unresolved. They do decide that there would be a Supreme Court. Once Congress gets elected and they take their seat, and Washington takes his oath of office, they go to work in passing this law called the Judiciary Act of 1789. There's a lot of going back and forth with the southern states. How powerful should the federal court system be? Some of the southern states don't even want a federal court system. But in the end, they agree upon creating lower courts, appellate courts, the appeals where you get to appeal your decisions, and all the way up to the Supreme Court. That yes, if there are laws being broken within a state, there will be these smaller federal courts there that would take care of it. And then you would work your way up the chain from a district court or a federal lower court to your appeals. You can appeal it to an appeal system and eventually to the Supreme Court. And once it gets to that part, that's it. And so the Judiciary Act of 1789 basically sets that up. So it's a very, very good law. It's a law that has created our court system to this day. And so Washington didn't come up with the law per se, but he did put his full support behind it, showing that, as the song says, it must be nice to have Washington on your side. I can't play those songs because I don't have copyrights for them, and I don't want to get banned in another country like I've been before. So we'll just move on and pretend like I've got music here. So key concept 3.2, Roman numeral 3, letter B. Political leaders in the 1790s. So now the 1790s are upon us. And this new nation is growing. And it tells you that they took a variety of positions on issues. And they named these issues, such as the relationship between a national government and the states. There are a lot of the Southerners who still want that old way of the Articles of Confederation where states' rights were the most important. The Federalist individuals are thinking more of a federal government, where the federal government should have final say in various matters. It talks about economic policy. We're going to get into Alexander Hamilton's financial policies here in just a few moments. We'll also talk about foreign policy, the balance between liberty and order, right? Where, Madison talked about how do you control factions, for instance. This all led to the formation of political parties. Nowhere in the Constitution does it allow for political parties. We're going to talk about these parties a little bit more specifically later on in class. You've got two parties that are, this is how they're mentioned here in the key concept. The Federalists, they list as first, created by Alexander Hamilton. Then they have what's called the Democratic Republican Party, led by Jefferson and James Madison. Although in all honesty, the Democratic Republican Party should come first, because it does come first before the Federalists. And as I will talk a lot about in class, they weren't called Democratic Republican. They were known as simply Republican Party. But one of the things that we totally understand, it's hard to think about the fact that there was a Republican Party before the Republican Party that you know, and that Republican Party that was before the one that you know becomes the Democratic Party that you now know, but you didn't know that, and now you do, so you don't know what you don't know until you know it. Did I confuse you? That's kind of the way politics is, right? It's very, very confusing. So let's kind of just give a little overview as to what it is that kind of starts the idea of these political parties. And so I'm going to go here. This is good examples you can use here, right? If you have your key concepts right here by letter B. So we'll start first with Hamilton. His financial plan. He's the Secretary of the Treasury. He's also the founding father, $10. Ooh, I don't have the rights to those songs. Okay, sorry. All right, so you have the national debt. This means what happened after the American Revolution. Many of the states were heavily in debt. Some states had paid off their debts, but others did not. He's asked by Congress to do a report on the debt. And so he goes before Congress, he does his homework, and he basically says that the debt is in three categories. Debt that is owed to a foreign nation. The Netherlands, we owed money to the Netherlands. We owed money to the French. All right, so we owe money. Debt that's owned by the national government to private citizens. Oftentimes, Washington would kind of just say, hey, I'm going to take all of your boats to get across a river, and I'll give you an IOU. So there's a lot of private citizens that they had confiscated or acquired certain things. There were some private citizens who actually loaned the government large sums of money in order to fight the war. And then there were the debt that was owed by states. Like I said, a lot of states had gone into debt to various private citizens as well. So Hamilton comes up with a plan. He calls it assumption. We're going to get into this very specifically in class, and so I want you to already know what this is before we talk about it. He wants to assume all debt. Debt by the national government, debt by the state governments, and assume it into one massive debt that will only be controlled by the federal government. And the South loses its mind over this. They see this as a hostile takeover by a federal government again. They see this again. If you have that power to take my debt, you're eventually going to come after my slaves. And so the South begins to resist this. Hamilton really needs this assumption to go through. Jefferson has arrived from France, and he's singing, what did I... Oh, there, I almost sang a song again. Sorry. And he plays dumb. And there is a dinner date that we're going to talk about in class that takes place between him, Madison and Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton. And no one was in the room where it happened. But some of you have no idea what the play Hamilton is about. But, well, I just feel sorry for you. That's how I'm going to do that one. But anyways, and it's agreed upon that a compromise, the only time that Hamilton and Jefferson will ever compromise is over this assumption. Hamilton will help agree to get the northern states to move the capital, which currently is in New York City, and it's supposed to go to Philadelphia for a little while, but eventually they're going to move it to land that's by Virginia. They're going to move it into the south off the Potomac River, and they're going to call this place the District of Columbia, and eventually it becomes known as Washington, D.C., in honor of George Washington. So he moves the capital south, and the Southerners give him his votes he needs in Congress to get his assumption plan through. The next thing he wants is a protective tariff. Tariffs are taxes on trade, on imported goods. America is growing as a nation. They're now going to create industry in the north, and they need to protect industry. They can't have a massive textile industry where they're creating clothing of all types, and England and France and Spain and the Netherlands flood America with cheaper made goods. So they put these tariffs on it, taxes, which then raises the price of those imported goods so American industry can compete. But what really gets Jefferson angry and over the edge is how is Hamilton going to finance all of this? Taking in all the debt, the assumption, creating a tariff, creating a national credit for the United States. He wants to build a Bank of the United States, a bank that will oversee all other banks in America. Right? One bank to rule them all, basically. You already have state banks, and Jefferson argues you don't need a federal bank. We have state banks. But the problem with that is, as a nation, you need a line of credit. You need to go to other countries and prove that you can back any loans that you need. You can't do that with state banks. They're not big enough. Having a national bank will help. It can also oversee the state banks as they go through times of flux with whatever they're doing in a state bank. Some of them are printing their own paper money, and that's creating inflation in a state. Well, this bank can oversee that and help them. This is when Jefferson gets angry. He goes to Washington to complain about the Bank of the United States. Washington is kind of on the fence, so he asks Hamilton and Jefferson to write essays. Jefferson comes up with the idea that it's not in the Constitution. And if it's not in the Constitution, that means the 9th and 10th Amendments tell us that if it's not in the Constitution, it belongs to the people and to the states. The word bank is not in the Constitution. So the bank belongs to the power of the people or power of the state. He is interpreting the Constitution strictly. We call this strict constructionism. If it's not in the Constitution, you can't do it. Hamilton comes back with, well, the Constitution does say that there are these implied powers. In Article 1, what creates the legislative branch, Congress, it says in there that Congress can create any law or all laws that they deem necessary and proper. We need a bank. It is necessary. The bank is going to help us establish credit, thereby it's proper. It is both necessary and proper. He is going to interpret the Constitution, that is Hamilton, loosely. Washington sides with Hamilton. Jefferson and Madison go off angrily, and that's when they start forming political parties. The other thing he gets done is a federal excise tax or a sales tax. And the number one thing that he taxes is whiskey, which will lead to a whiskey rebellion in Pennsylvania, but the federal government will put that down pretty quickly. See, Jefferson's America was going to be something completely different. Jefferson wants this agrarian society, and that's a word we're going to use a lot in class, agrarian. That's a farming society, agriculture. He saw Hamilton as a non-elected individual. He's appointed by the president who has too much power. That bothered Jefferson a lot. And again, as I said earlier, the Constitution to Jefferson must be interpreted strictly, how it is written. Of course, when he becomes president, we're going to talk about he ain't going to be no strict constructionist. He's going to get a little loosey-goosey too. Now, this is the moment when I often tell students, you can pause because I got myself some nice, refreshing iced tea. I do like iced tea. So take a moment, pause, get yourself a snack, and come back. I'll wait. Glad to have you back. Okay, so like I said, Jefferson is a strict constructionist. There's no mention of a bank in the Constitution. This is what got him angry. So him and his friend James Madison, who by the way was the father of the Constitution, started off as a Federalist, does the biggest political flip-flop in our history, and is now going to help form this Jefferson Republican Party. The ideas of what he thinks is the Declaration of Independence, that Republican movement that happened during the actual war. He feels that Hamilton and his guys are becoming more like monarchs, which is kind of strange because Hamilton actually fought in the war and Jefferson did not, which we'll get into that in class. All right, let's move along. Treaties with Indians. Key concept 3.3, Roman numeral 1, letter D. An ambiguous relationship between the federal government and American Indian tribes contribute to the problems regarding treaties and American Indian legal claims relating to the seizure of their lands. I'm trying out to be a radio announcer. Yeah, America is going to have a long history of just not treating Native people correctly. Every single treaty the United States will make with Indian tribes, they will eventually break them. A confederation of Indians in the Old Northwest are going to try to fight to stay in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, parts of Michigan. Oftentimes this is known as the Miami Confederacy because the Miami Indians kind of were a catalyst to this. And the Miami Indians originate out of Ohio, by the way. I know we might think of Miami, Florida. That's where a lot of them wound up running away to get away from the Americans. But it's really not necessarily just a Miami Confederation. It's a huge, large group of various Indian tribes, and they begin to win some battles. So Washington really decides to put his full effort of his army behind it, and his name is, was it? Man, it just went out of my brain. Mad Anthony Wayne. That's his nickname. Anthony Wayne is his name. The General Anthony Wayne, but he's known as Mad Anthony Wayne. He raises an army at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. He decimates this Indian army. They're forced to sign the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. The Treaty of Greenville basically, all Indians that live in Indiana, Ohio, these various states, Wisconsin, Michigan, they have to give up all rights to the land. They're not going to ever be allowed to say, this is our land anymore. But the federal government will allow them to stay, to hunt, to fish, and do those sorts of things. Under the Treaty of Greenville, they were also supposed to give them an annual lump sum of money every year to help them. That's one of the things America isn't always going to do, that one. There's a young warrior here by the name of Tecumseh. He's going to become very important to us. We get closer to the War of 1812. He will never sign this treaty, and he will stay in a perpetual state of war with the United States. And so this is 1795. So a little more than 10 years, 11 years later will come, and he will go to war again with the United States. So there's always this tension between native tribes and this growing United States government. Oh, Fallen Timbers, there it went. Ba-dum-tsh, dad jokes. So our last key concept we're going to look at here is 3.3, Roman numeral 2, A and B. So we have the United States government forge diplomatic initiatives aimed at dealing with the continued British and Spanish presence in North America. After the American Revolution, Great Britain kept forts in Ohio, parts of Michigan and Wisconsin. The Spanish controlled the Mississippi River. Of course, they're in Florida. This becomes a problem. But I want to point out this word here, impressment. Something we're going to talk a lot about. Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and finally James Madison. 4 presidents. That's going to be 4, 8. See, that's 8. Sorry, 16, 24, 28 years of dealing with this thing called impressment. The British Navy off the Atlantic Ocean will constantly capture American merchant ships, ships of trade, not warships, but our trade ships, what's called merchant ships. They'll capture these ships, they'll randomly grab Americans and impress them, or what the term is called to impress you into service, to force you into service into the British Navy. If they don't do it, they're taken back to England to serve the rest of their life in a prison or a dungeon in England. George Washington will send, what's his name? John Jay. Yeah, that's right. The forgettable guy. We keep forgetting this guy, John Jay. Sends John Jay to England to negotiate a treaty. Leave the forts in the Ohio area, the Old Northwest. Stop arming Native American Indians and inciting them to riots. And stop impressing our sailors. When he gets to London, he is told immediately, the first rule of impressment, we don't talk impressment. So that's not even allowed to be discussed. Jay gets a treaty with the British where they promise they'll leave these forts. They never do. It's a weak treaty, but it's America's first real foray, as we say, into foreign policy. It is basically, though, a failure. However, the Spanish are watching this, and again, we don't have telephones or computers or television. They assume that Jay's treaty is some kind of a military alliance. So the following year, another diplomat by the name of Pinckney, he goes to Spain, and we get Pinckney's treaty. Spain gives the United States the rights to navigate the Mississippi River. Something they're going to regret afterwards. Because once you give America rights to something, you give them a river, they're going to want a continent. It's just, oh, America. But Pinckney's treaty was a success. Jay's treaty, not so much. Then B tells us that war between France and Britain. Napoleon is on the rise. Napoleon is upon us. Well, actually, I take it back. I got to step back. 1793, it's a little bit different. Napoleon's actually not here yet, but he's a general out there. The King of France is going to be beheaded. The reign of terror is upon us. Thousands of French and Parisians are losing their head. This is a revolution that keeps consuming itself. If you studied any of this in world history, you know, they start off as what the Committee of Public Safety after they overthrew the king, and then they start to kill themselves in the guillotine. Then they become the Public Directory, and then they start to kill themselves again in the Reign of Terror. And then Napoleon comes and becomes a dictator, and then he becomes Emperor of France. Washington cannot, there's no way he wants to get involved. Jefferson freely wants to get involved because Jefferson is going to love everything French. He's a Francophile. Hamilton and the Federalists are into the British. Washington decides to declare neutrality. This is going to be a running theme for Washington. Neutrality. We're going to get into class. Letter C we're going to do in class is Washington's farewell address. He doesn't want the United States involved in foreign wars. He is going to bring down a lasting legacy of neutrality and staying out of foreign alliances. And we're going to get into his farewell address very specifically in class. He also is going to warn the United States about political parties as well. Yeah. Thank you, George. Kind of wish we'd have listened to you on that one. Anyways, guys, well, that's it for this. I hope you enjoyed this one. I said I would have sung songs, but you know I don't want to get in trouble, you know. But all right, I'll see everybody in class. Have a good evening.